The global trade barometer is flashing red again. Brussels and Ottawa have simultaneously pressed their second-stage retaliation buttons, and President Trump's newly proposed 30% tariffs now face a reinforced $150 billion crossfire. This time built not only from steel and concrete, but from coordinated economic pressure and carbon-bound trade walls. Europe's latest response includes 90 targeted goods stretching from Boeing aircraft to Kentucky bourbon, while Canada's strike hits supply chains spanning Detroit's engine blocks to British Columbia's ports. So the question is, will Washington pull back or double down and risk locking its own industrial ecosystem behind its own tariff wall? Now let's break down the European Union and Canada's detailed countermeasures to the renewed U.S. tariffs and the real economic impact this could have on American industry. But first, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon for notifications, and like the video to stay current on global trade developments. That July morning, as Atlantic winds swept across the coastlines of Europe and North America, a silent signal pulsed from the steel towers of Brussels to the whitewashed chambers of Washington. The European Commission released a tightly worded internal note, barely a sentence long, signaling that its second wave of retaliatory tariffs would exceed the previously announced 26 billion euros and push toward 93 billion euros, approximately $108 billion at today's exchange rate. With the initial response already locked in at $24.5 billion, this set the total crossfire above $130 billion. The Commission simply noted that the approval would move through the Trade Policy Committee. But the tone made clear this was a launch sequence, not a diplomatic pause. While Washington was still absorbing the backlash from Trump's latest 30% tariff decree, the EU's second list dropped like a flashbang. No press conference, only quiet precision. On the list, Boeing passenger jets and their spare fuselage sections, Honeywell avionics modules, SUVs from the Detroit assembly line, semiconductor fabrication equipment from California, and agricultural exports from Kansas, wheat to Tennessee whiskey. As a symbolic gesture, bourbon and rum were placed mid-list, not just for economic effect, but to trigger America's agriculture and beverage lobbies, which hold sway in the Senate's corridors. Once the EU's list is finalized, exporters will be hit with tariff rates spiking as high as 35%, affecting port transactions, shipping schedules, and even leasing contracts. But this wasn't just about math or dollar loss. The message was strategic. If you build walls, we'll build towers. The initial 26 billion euro response had been pegged as proportional. But as Trump intensified his rhetoric, major EU players, Berlin, Paris, Rome, regrouped and added a hidden annex to the list, including aircraft components, luxury vehicles, electronic parts, and industrial chemicals. Behind closed doors, EU officials hinted, if Congress doesn't force a rollback, the bloc is ready to deploy a third-stage countermeasure reaching 115 billion euros, about $135 billion. Simultaneously, another move was forming in the north. Just 48 hours after Ottawa capped its first round of tariffs at 15.6 billion Canadian dollars in response to U.S. steel and aluminum actions, a second draft list leaked to the media. Valued near 53 billion Canadian dollars, about 40 billion US dollars, it covered everything from vehicle components to home appliances, electrical goods to sub-assembly parts. Canada's finance minister stated plainly, Plan B is ready. If the U.S. builds a permanent wall, we'll build a permanent corridor. The most formidable item in Ottawa's plan is a built-in trigger mechanism. If steel or aluminum imports from the U.S. exceed Canada's new quotas, duties would surge up to 50%, adding between 400 and 500 Canadian dollars per ton in extra costs. With that, Brussels and Ottawa had drawn a circle, a $150 billion enclosure pinning Trump's trade war from both east and north. To understand the weight of that figure, consider this. The 2018 steel and aluminum standoff inflicted economic blows estimated between $20 and $30 billion on both sides. It was a bruising but short-lived clash. Today, however, the battlefield is larger and more flammable. The WTO's appellate body remains in limbo, meaning legal remedies are frozen. Without arbitration, retaliation becomes the only available counterstrike. In Washington, internal divisions are growing. Production-heavy states still view the tariffs as employment shields, but corporate headquarters are panicking. In Seattle, Boeing executives are calculating losses. A 35% tariff from Europe could collapse their order book. Aircraft leasing is done in Dublin, maintenance hubs operate in Hamburg and Lüneburg, and inventory is managed through Amsterdam. If clients shift to Airbus, whose aircraft are exempt, entire logistics chains may migrate. At Honeywell's Arizona campus, 1,500 software and avionics engineers are whispering that European competition has already narrowed the tech gap. One shockwave could break the tie. Senate mailboxes are now flooded with letters from indirect workers, lobbyists, and state officials demanding urgent de-escalation. The fight extends far beyond aviation. Detroit's EV and luxury SUV supply chain is in distress. Europe's new list specifically targets these vehicles. If the EU moves into Phase 3, it could apply a 20% surcharge on combustion engine SUVs and pickup trucks. Europe already sources similar models from within its own borders and increasingly from South Korea. If American brands face surging euro-based costs, European dealers can reconfigure inventory within a week. That would slice Detroit's export access window in half. Canada's retaliation is also hitting Detroit's heart. The Michigan-Ontario Supply Tunnel, responsible for steel sheeting, engine parts, and transmission systems, is under strain. America's automotive supply chain now feels pressure from both coasts. Chemicals, farm goods, electronics, all are fair game. The EU's second list targets dozens of sectors designed to trigger lobbying firestorms inside the Beltway. Oil companies rerouting back from the Middle East are feeling Europe's new fuel quota. Midwestern corn growers fear the reemergence of 2019's bourbon tax losses. A Texas rum distillery has warned of Caribbean market collapse. Florida citrus exporters are now scanning EU fruit lists for their SKUs. As retaliation expands, Washington's coalition is fracturing. Canada, while less theatrical, is just as serious. Ottawa isn't building a wall, but its tariff ceiling has a 50% shockwave waiting underneath. That's a red line for U.S. exporters. Warehouses in Windsor attempted to preload American steel before the quotas took effect, but federal customs cracked down, calling it artificial stockpiling. Retroactive inspections on 3 months of imports ended the game. Canadian buyers now face two options: either build new steel mills at home or pivot to Australia, South Korea, or Brazil. Either outcome slashes America's market share. When Canadian Prime Minister Carney declared that these tariffs would outlast negotiations and become embedded into national industrial policy, the game changed. Toronto's finance corridor pivoted. Banks opened credit lines for domestic steel and low-carbon aluminum projects. Quebec's hydro-powered grid already allows aluminum production at 1/4 the carbon intensity of the U.S. European buyers are now signing contracts for Canadian aluminum, advertised as green certified. In turn, the U.S. aluminum sector, behind Trump's tariff wall, faces a premium and an identity crisis. Europe is moving in the same direction. The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism will go live in full by 2026. Products like engines, factory machines, and electronics with high emission scores will face extra fees on top of import duties. So, U.S. exports will face dual penalties, standard tariffs and carbon tariffs. Meanwhile, European manufacturers will wear the badge of domestic, low-emission compliance. The environmental front is now fully entangled in the trade war. Washington has floated taking the issue to the WTO, but with the dispute mechanism still dormant, retaliation continues unchecked. The logic is simple: no referee, no rules. The U.S. Trade Representative's office responded by calling the EU's list excessive and warned that targeting commercial aviation and agriculture violates prior norms. Brussels countered with a single phrase: proportionality is not the size of the tax, but the scale of the damage. While the rhetoric intensifies, the Canadian press is portraying Carney's announcement as a decisive break, and EU newspapers are running banner headlines about the €93 billion second dose. Amid this media storm, American consumers are facing the practical consequences: rising prices on cars, electronics, home appliances, and even whiskey. Behind the scenes, analysts warn of cascading effects. If Boeing's EU orders collapse, the estimated loss could hit $110 billion in just 5 years. Honeywell's research investments could shrink by $2 billion annually. Detroit's SUV market share in Europe could plunge from 18% to under 7%. And the combined effect of declining bourbon sales and corn demand could once again haunt the Midwest. Meanwhile, Canadian aluminum is overtaking U.S. products in Europe. Brazilian steel is entering Canada's construction sites. South Korean electronics are flowing into EU contracts. The trade maps are being redrawn in real time. This new landscape mixes industrial policy with carbon benchmarks, tariff matrices, and digital trade codes. If Canada increases its steel recycling rate, accelerates hydrogen-powered smelting, and leverages its renewable energy grid, and if the EU continues funding electric arc furnace investments, the US could ironically end up subsidizing its competitors through isolation. Trump's protectionist stance may feel like a short-term safety net, but in the long term, it's pushing America into a disadvantageous triangle: cost, technology, and carbon. Now all eyes are on Washington. Will the first real pushback come from the Senate's Farm Belt, Seattle's aerospace boardrooms, the Detroit-Ohio auto corridor, or the Kentucky-Tennessee whiskey barons? The answer will determine whether Brussels activates its €135 billion Phase 3 and whether Ottawa officially publishes its $40 billion Canadian dollar package in the next fiscal cycle. Behind closed doors, pens are clicking, tariff charts are being updated, and product SKUs are being reassigned new customs codes. This is not a random collision. It's a structured, calculated trade showdown, complete with parallel climate and industrial blueprints. On both sides of the Atlantic, factory heads, researchers, trade union leaders, senators, and customs agents are breathing in sync, but at vastly different rhythms. America's tariffs have catalyzed Europe and Canada into launching their most synchronized trade retaliation yet. And no one can say when or how the curtain will fall. What is certain is this: when it does, the global trade stage will look unrecognizable. A patchwork of blue, red, and carbon green, stamped with QR codes, emission scores, and asymmetric duty brackets. What are your thoughts? Drop your opinions in the comments. And if you want to keep up with our coverage, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.